The flight attendant's hand struck hard, the sound cutting through the quiet cabin. Passengers gasped, watching in stunned silence. But the woman who had just been slapped didn't react. Not with anger, not with tears. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She dialed a number, her voice calm. "She just slapped me," she said. On the other end of the call, a man's voice hardened. "Which flight are you on?" The flight attendant smirked, unaware that in just moments her entire world was about to collapse. Because the woman she had just humiliated, she was the wife of the airline's owner. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more. The passengers slowly filled the cabin, settling into their seats as the flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, checking seatbelts and stowing luggage. Among them was Roshni, dressed in a plain cotton dress with her hair neatly tied back. She had no jewelry on, no expensive handbag, nothing that would suggest she was anyone important. She stepped into the plane quietly, clutching her small purse as she found her seat in the business class section. The seat was comfortable, much better than the economy class she had been used to. She had traveled many times before, but never in luxury. And today, she had chosen to sit in business class for the first time. Not because she couldn't afford it, but because she rarely allowed herself such comforts. She preferred a simple life, away from attention. She adjusted the seatbelt around her waist and glanced out the window, watching the last of the luggage being loaded onto the plane. It was a long flight ahead, and she was looking forward to resting, but her peace was soon interrupted. A sharp voice cut through the air, dragging attention toward her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The voice belonged to Liana, a senior flight attendant who carried herself with authority. She had been working for the airline for years and had learned how to judge people with just one glance. She stood tall in her crisp uniform, looking down at Roshni as if she had caught her in the wrong place. Roshni turned her head and met Liana's piercing gaze. She nodded and reached into her purse, pulling out her boarding pass. "Yes, this is my seat," she said softly, handing over the ticket. Liana took the ticket with a frown, scanning it quickly. The seat number was correct, but something about Roshni didn't sit right with her. The woman didn't look like she belonged in business class. Her clothes were too simple, her demeanor too quiet. The other business class passengers were dressed in tailored suits and fine dresses, carrying designer bags and expensive watches. But this woman, she looked like someone who worked for them, not someone who traveled alongside them. Liana handed back the ticket with a forced smile, but her eyes held something else. "All right then," she muttered before turning away. Roshni settled back into her seat, ignoring the uncomfortable feeling that had begun to creep in. She had experienced this kind of treatment before, being looked down upon because of the way she dressed, the way she carried herself. It didn't bother her much. She had learned long ago that people only saw what they wanted to see. As the last few passengers boarded, Liana moved through the cabin, greeting others with a pleasant smile. But when she passed Roshni again, her expression tightened. Something about the woman made her uneasy. She didn't understand why someone like her was sitting here. A maid, maybe? A servant who had managed to get her hands on a luxury seat? The thought irritated her, but she brushed it aside. The flight was about to take off, and she had more important things to worry about. The plane roared to life as it began taxiing down the runway. Roshni leaned her head back, closing her eyes as the aircraft lifted into the sky. She had no idea that the woman who had just questioned her presence would soon do something far worse. And when the truth came out, it wouldn't just be a lesson in humility. It would be the end of Liana's entire career. The flight had reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt signs flickered off. Passengers settled into their seats, some flipping through magazines while others scrolled on their phones. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, handing out drinks and attending to requests. Liana kept her posture straight, her polished shoes clicking softly against the cabin floor as she made her way toward the business class section again. Her eyes drifted to Roshni, who sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap. Something about the woman continued to bother her. Every time Liana looked at her, she felt irritated, as if Roshni's mere presence in this section was a mistake that needed to be corrected. She had served business class passengers for years, and they always carried themselves with a certain attitude, an air of superiority that made them easy to recognize. But Roshni? She sat with the stillness of someone who didn't belong. A man seated nearby, Adrian, adjusted his watch and leaned slightly toward Liana as she passed. "Excuse me," he said in a low voice. "I believe there's been an error. I don't think she's supposed to be here." Liana turned to him, her lips curving slightly. "I was thinking the same thing," she murmured. Roshni overheard them but kept her expression neutral. She had been in situations like this before, where people assumed her worth based on her appearance. She chose to stay silent, but she could feel the heat rising in her chest. Liana straightened her uniform and walked toward Roshni's seat again. She stopped beside her and folded her arms. "Ma'am, may I see your ticket again?" Roshni looked up, confusion flashing in her eyes. "You already checked it," she said, her voice calm. "I'd like to verify it once more," Liana insisted. Roshni sighed and reached for her purse. She pulled out the ticket and handed it over. Liana snatched it, scanning it quickly. The seat number was correct, the class was correct, everything was in order. But instead of admitting that she had made a mistake, Liana forced a tight smile. "This ticket seems unusual," she said, tilting her head. "Where did you purchase it?" Roshni blinked, taken aback by the question. "Why does that matter?" Liana ignored the question and instead leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You do understand that business class has different standards, don't you? It's meant for a certain type of traveler." A tense silence settled between them. A few passengers nearby were now watching the interaction. Some shifted uncomfortably, while others observed with quiet curiosity. Roshni met Liana's gaze, unshaken. "And what type of traveler do you think I am?" Liana forced another smile, this one thinner than before. "I'm only asking routine questions. We have had cases where economy passengers were mistakenly assigned business class seats." A soft scoff came from behind them. A woman, Celeste, who had been quietly sipping her wine, turned her head. "That's funny," she said, tapping a finger against her glass. "You didn't ask anyone else those questions. Just her." Liana stiffened. Celeste shrugged. "I've been flying business for years, and I've never seen a flight attendant ask where someone bought their ticket." Roshni remained quiet, but she could see the way Liana's face tensed. The attendant was trying to stay composed, but the cracks in her confidence were beginning to show. Still, Liana wasn't ready to back down. She placed the ticket on Roshni's tray table with a sharp motion. "Enjoy your flight," she said, her voice clipped, before turning on her heel and walking away. Roshni exhaled slowly. She picked up the ticket and slipped it back into her purse. She thought that would be the end of it, that Liana would leave her alone now. But she was wrong, because Liana wasn't just irritated, she was angry. And soon her frustration would lead her to make a mistake she could never take back. Liana stormed into the galley, her grip tightening around the tray in her hands. She could still feel the weight of Celeste's words, the quiet judgment from the passengers. It made her blood boil. She had been working this job for years, dealing with all kinds of people, and yet today, one woman, a woman who clearly didn't belong in business class, was making her feel like she was in the wrong. Hannah, a junior flight attendant, glanced up from where she was organizing refreshments. "Something wrong?" she asked, noticing the tension on Liana's face. Liana let out a sharp breath, adjusting her posture. "No," she muttered, forcing a smile. "Just dealing with seating issues." Hannah frowned slightly but didn't push the matter. She had been working under Liana long enough to know that when she was in one of her moods, it was best not to question her. Meanwhile, back in the business class cabin, Roshni sat with her hands in her lap, staring out the window. She could still feel the stares of a few passengers, could hear the quiet murmurs. She wasn't new to this kind of treatment, but something about today felt different. It wasn't just judgment, it was something more personal. She didn't know why Liana had decided to single her out, but she had a feeling it wasn't over yet. Adrian, the man who had whispered to Liana earlier, cleared his throat. "You know," he said, tilting his head toward Roshni, "if you had trouble getting a ticket, you could have just asked for an upgrade instead of taking someone else's seat." Roshni turned to him slowly, her face unreadable. "I didn't take anyone's seat," she said evenly. Adrian smirked, sipping from his glass. "Sure." Celeste, still seated nearby, rolled her eyes. "I don't know what's more annoying, her being questioned like she's a criminal or you pretending you know anything about her." Adrian scoffed but said nothing. He turned back to his tablet, acting as if the conversation had never happened. Roshni remained silent. She had nothing to prove to these people. But deep inside, something stirred, an old feeling she had buried long ago. The same feeling she had when people looked at her and assumed she was less, assumed she was nothing more than the way she dressed. Minutes passed, and the attendants began serving drinks. Liana returned to the cabin, her expression once again composed. She moved through the rows, handing out glasses with a polite smile. When she reached Roshni's seat, she hesitated for only a second before placing a glass of water in front of her. "There you go," she said, her tone unreadable. Roshni glanced at the drink, then back at Liana. "Thank you," she said simply. Liana didn't respond. She turned away, continuing her duties, but her mind was still unsettled. She had been so sure Roshni didn't belong, yet she had no proof, and that made her frustration grow. But she wouldn't have to wait much longer, because soon an opportunity would come. A small moment, one where Liana could remind this woman exactly where she stood. And when that moment came, she wouldn't hesitate. The cabin remained quiet, with only the hum of the engines filling the air. Most passengers were settled into their seats, sipping their drinks or flipping through in-flight entertainment. The tension from earlier had started to fade, but Roshni could still feel the occasional glance in her direction. She ignored it, focusing on the steady view outside the window. Liana, however, wasn't done watching her. She moved through the aisles, keeping an eye on every movement Roshni made. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was personal. Something about the woman's calmness, her refusal to be rattled, made Liana's irritation grow. She wanted to see her flustered, to see her embarrassed, to prove that she didn't belong in business class. A sudden jolt ran through the plane as mild turbulence hit, causing the beverage cart to shake slightly. Hannah, who was serving a passenger a few rows ahead, paused to steady herself. Liana, using the moment to distract herself, turned and grabbed a napkin from the cart. Just as she was about to turn away, Roshni stood from her seat, adjusting her purse strap on her shoulder. She moved carefully toward the aisle, stepping past the cart to head toward the restroom. Liana's eyes narrowed. She immediately stepped in front of Roshni, blocking her path. "Where are you going?" she asked sharply. Roshni stopped, startled by the sudden confrontation. "To the restroom," she answered. Liana folded her arms. "The business class restroom is for business class passengers only." Roshni's brows pulled together. "And I am a business class passenger." The air between them thickened. Passengers nearby turned their heads slightly, pretending not to listen while clearly paying attention. Liana let out a small, breathy laugh. "You know," she said in a hushed voice, "it's okay to admit if you're in the wrong place. If you're more comfortable using the economy restroom, I can let you go there." Roshni exhaled slowly, her patience thinning. "I paid for this seat. I have just as much right to use this restroom as anyone else here." Liana's smile turned cold. "That's interesting," she murmured, "because I've never seen someone in business class without a single luxury item on them. No watch, no jewelry, no expensive handbag, just a simple dress." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably at her words. Celeste, seated nearby, let out a quiet scoff, but didn't speak yet. Roshni held Liana's gaze unshaken. "I didn't know my outfit needed your approval to use the restroom." Liana's jaw tightened. She was losing control of the situation and she hated it. She had expected Roshni to react defensively, maybe even shrink away in embarrassment. But instead, the woman remained perfectly composed, standing tall despite the subtle humiliation Liana was trying to force upon her. Roshni moved a step past her, but Liana shifted in front of her again. "You're holding up the aisle," Liana said coolly. "I suggest you wait." Roshni clenched her jaw but didn't argue. She stepped back slightly, giving Liana one last look before returning to her seat. Celeste watched the entire exchange and let out a sigh. "That was pathetic," she muttered, loud enough for Liana to hear. Liana ignored her, turning sharply on her heel as she pushed the beverage cart forward. She wasn't done yet, not even close. Because now she wasn't just irritated, she was determined. And the next time Roshni stepped out of line, she wouldn't just use words to put her back in her place. The tension in the cabin didn't fade. Even though Roshni had returned to her seat, she could feel the weight of Liana's presence lingering nearby. The flight attendant moved through the aisle, her expression neutral, but there was a sharpness in her movements, a quiet frustration boiling beneath her controlled demeanor. Celeste leaned slightly toward Roshni and whispered, "She's got a problem with you, and not even trying to hide it." Roshni gave a small nod but said nothing. She had seen people like Liana before, people who thought power came from uniform and status. They weren't worth arguing with. But something told her that Liana wasn't going to let this go. The flight continued, with attendants serving meals and passengers getting comfortable. The atmosphere seemed to settle, but only for a while. A soft chime rang through the cabin, signaling that a passenger needed assistance. Liana, still restless, saw the light blinking above Roshni's seat. Her lips pressed into a thin smile. This was her chance. She walked over slowly, adjusting her uniform before stopping beside Roshni's seat. "Yes?" she asked in a clipped tone. Roshni looked up, confused. "I didn't call for assistance." Liana's smile didn't waver. "Are you sure? The call light above your seat is on." Roshni glanced up, her brows pulling together. She hadn't touched the button. Liana sighed dramatically. "If you don't need help, please be mindful not to press buttons you don't understand." A few passengers turned their heads, catching the remark. Celeste let out a quiet chuckle under her breath. "That's interesting," Celeste said. "I saw her sitting still the whole time. You sure the button wasn't, I don't know, pressed by accident from somewhere else?" Liana's expression didn't change, but her fingers curled slightly at her sides. "I don't make mistakes like that," she said smoothly. "If the light came from this seat, then it must have been pressed." Roshni met her gaze steadily. "I didn't press it," she said firmly. Liana tilted her head, her smile still in place. "Well, next time just be careful." She reached over and turned off the call light before stepping away, her movements slow and deliberate. Roshni watched her walk off, her patience wearing thinner by the minute. She hadn't pressed the button, and she had a strong feeling that Liana knew that too. But why? Why was she so determined to prove that Roshni didn't belong here? Celeste shook her head. "She's playing games with you." Roshni exhaled slowly. "I know." Celeste studied her for a moment. "You're not going to let her win, are you?" Roshni's fingers tightened slightly on the armrest. "No," she murmured. "I'm not." But she didn't have to do anything, because soon Liana would push too far, and when she did, there would be no turning back. The flight continued, but the tension between Roshni and Liana remained thick in the air. Every now and then, Liana would glance in her direction, as if waiting for an opportunity to challenge her again. Roshni, however, remained composed, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her expression giving nothing away. Liana moved through the cabin, but no matter how many passengers she assisted, her mind kept circling back to Roshni. She hated how unaffected the woman seemed. Most passengers would have apologized by now, embarrassed by the constant scrutiny. But Roshni? She sat there, completely unshaken, and it irritated Liana more than she wanted to admit. A few rows away, Adrian smirked as he leaned toward Celeste. "She's really got it out for her, huh?" Celeste rolled her eyes. It's getting embarrassing at this point. Meanwhile, in the galley, Hannah was refilling a tray of drinks when Liana stormed in, letting out a sharp breath. Hannah gave her a quick glance. "You okay?" Liana grabbed a cloth and wiped an invisible stain from the counter. "She's getting under my skin," she muttered. Hannah frowned. "Who?" Liana didn't answer at first, but Hannah already knew. She had seen the way Liana kept hovering around Roshni's seat, searching for reasons to challenge her. "Liana, just let it go," Hannah said carefully. "You checked her ticket. She's a business class passenger like everyone else. Maybe stop making a big deal out of it." Liana's jaw tightened. "You don't get it. She doesn't act like she belongs here." Hannah crossed her arms. "Or maybe you don't like the fact that she does." Liana shot her a glare but said nothing. Hannah shook her head and grabbed the tray. "Just do your job and leave her alone. The last thing you need is a complaint against you." But a complaint wasn't what Liana was worried about. She wanted Roshni to break, to show even a flicker of discomfort, to admit that she wasn't like the others in business class. And when she saw Roshni stand up a few minutes later, adjusting the strap of her purse again, Liana didn't think twice before following her. This time she wasn't going to let her walk away without consequences, because in her mind, Roshni had already crossed a line, and Liana was ready to put her back in her place. Roshni made her way toward the restroom again, her steps steady despite the weight of Liana's constant scrutiny. She wasn't one to let things bother her easily, but it was clear now. Liana wasn't just being rude, she was determined to humiliate her. As she reached the restroom door and reached for the handle, a sharp grip closed around her wrist. "Not so fast," Liana's voice came from behind her. Roshni turned slowly, her eyes meeting Liana's. The flight attendant's expression was firm, her nails digging slightly into Roshni's skin before she released her grip. "This restroom is currently unavailable," Liana said smoothly, blocking the door with her body. Roshni glanced at the small occupied/vacant sign. It was green. The restroom was empty. "It doesn't look unavailable to me," she said evenly. Liana's smile was tight. "It is now." Passengers nearby turned their heads slightly, sensing another confrontation. Roshni could feel the weight of their gazes, but she refused to give Liana the satisfaction of reacting. "Liana," Hannah's voice suddenly cut in as she approached, her brows pulling together in confusion. "What's going on?" Liana barely turned her head. "I was just explaining that this restroom is off limits for now." Hannah frowned, glancing at the vacant sign. "Since when?" Liana's jaw clenched slightly. "Since now." Hannah stared at her for a moment before shifting her gaze to Roshni, clearly sensing that something was off. "Liana," she said in a lower voice, "it's just a restroom, let her use it." Liana exhaled sharply through her nose. "There are restrooms in economy." A hush fell over the small space. Roshni felt the words settle in, and she wasn't the only one. Even Hannah's expression shifted, her eyes darkening. Hannah's voice was sharp this time. "What is your problem?" Liana finally turned to face her fully, her frustration boiling over. "My problem? My problem is that she doesn't belong in business class, Hannah. Look at her." The words left her mouth louder than she had intended. A few passengers audibly gasped. Celeste, still in her seat, let out an exaggerated scoff. "Wow," she finally said it out loud. Roshni stood still, her heart steady. Liana was unraveling and she knew it. But before she could say anything, Liana did something no one expected. Without warning, without thinking, she reached out and slapped Roshni across the face. A loud, sharp crack echoed through the cabin. The entire aisle fell into stunned silence. Roshni's head turned slightly from the force, her cheek burning, but she didn't step back. She didn't stagger. She simply turned her gaze back to Liana, her expression unreadable. Passengers gaped in shock. Hannah's hand flew to her mouth. A businessman who had been watching dropped his pen onto his tray table. For the first time, Liana realized exactly what she had done. Her breath hitched, her hand still frozen in the air. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, Roshni lifted her hand, not to retaliate, not to touch her burning cheek, but to reach for the small purse that hung from her shoulder. And when she pulled out her phone, Liana's stomach dropped, because Roshni wasn't calling the police. She was calling someone much worse. The entire business class cabin sat frozen in shock. The sharp sound of the slap still echoed in the air, leaving a tension so thick that no one dared to move. Liana's own breathing had become uneven, her fingers trembling slightly from what she had just done. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a disaster. Roshni's cheek stung, but she showed no reaction. She didn't raise her hand to touch it, didn't flinch, didn't even look shaken. Instead, she calmly unlocked her phone, her fingers moving with deliberate slowness. The passengers nearby watched, their eyes flicking between her and Liana, waiting for what would happen next. Hannah, who had just witnessed everything, found her voice first. "Liana," she hissed, her face pale. "What the hell did you just do?" Liana's throat felt dry. Her mind scrambled for an excuse, for some way to explain what had just happened. But there was no excuse for this. She had let her emotions get the best of her, and now there was no way to take it back. Liana started, but the words felt weak even as they left her lips. Roshni's phone rang once, twice. Then a voice answered on the other end. "Are you okay?" The voice was deep, controlled, but there was something dangerous underneath it. Liana's breath caught. She recognized that voice. Roshni tilted her head slightly, keeping her gaze locked on Liana's as she spoke into the phone. "I'm fine," she said, her voice as calm as ever. "But there's been an incident." Liana swallowed hard. The businessman seated a row away. Daniel leaned forward slightly, intrigued. Celeste let out a low whistle. "Oh, you're in trouble," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. Liana stepped back, her face draining of color. She hadn't asked for this woman's full name, hadn't even considered it. But now, with the way she was speaking, so composed, so sure of herself, it sent a chill down Liana's spine. "Tell me everything," the voice on the phone instructed. Roshni's lips curled slightly. Not a smirk, not arrogance, just a quiet understanding that everything was about to change. "A flight attendant just slapped me," she said simply. A silence followed on the other end of the call. Then finally the voice spoke again. "Which flight are you on?" Liana's breathing quickened. Hannah glanced between them, sensing the shift. "Roshni," she said carefully, her voice laced with concern. "Who are you calling?" Roshni glanced at her for the briefest moment before answering. "My husband." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Adrian, the man who had whispered about Roshni not belonging, straightened in his seat, suddenly realizing he had been very, very wrong. Liana's lips parted slightly, confusion and panic flashing in her eyes. "Your husband?" she repeated. Roshni didn't break eye contact as she continued speaking into the phone. "Yes, love," she said, her tone shifting slightly, softening just a fraction. "I'm on flight 372. Another pause. Then the voice on the phone said something that made Liana's stomach twist violently. "I'll handle it." And then the call ended. Roshni placed the phone back into her purse and turned to step past Liana, her posture as poised as ever. Liana's voice came out before she could stop herself. Who is your husband?" Roshni stopped and looked at her, a small flicker of amusement in her eyes now. "Veer Rajan," she said simply. The moment the name left her lips, a visible shudder ran through Liana. Celeste let out a stunned laugh. "Oh, this is better than a movie," she muttered. Liana stumbled slightly, gripping the side of a seat for support. Veer Rajan, the owner of the very airline she worked for, the man who had built an empire in the aviation industry, a name that carried power, more power than she could ever dream of, and she had just slapped his wife. Liana's mind raced, searching for a way out of this, a way to undo what she had done. But there was no undoing it, because now, the entire plane knew. And worse, Veer Rajan knew too. The weight of her mistake settled over her like a crushing force. Hannah let out a slow breath. "Oh, Liana," she murmured, "you just ruined your entire life." Liana didn't answer. She couldn't, because she knew Hannah was right. Liana felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Her body remained frozen in place, But her mind was spinning, scrambling for a way to fix the disaster she had just created. She had humiliated this woman, slapped her in front of an entire cabin of witnesses, thinking she was nothing more than an out-of-place maid. But now, she knew the truth. Roshni wasn't just a passenger. She wasn't just some nobody who had stumbled into business class. She was the wife of Veer Rajan, the man who controlled the very airline she worked for. The realization made Liana's stomach twist violently. Passengers murmured amongst themselves, eyes flicking between Liana and Roshni. Some were in disbelief, while others exchanged knowing looks, as if they had expected something like this to happen. Adrian, who had been so quick to assume Roshni didn't belong, suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear into his seat. Celeste, on the other hand, had a smug smirk on her face, sipping her wine with the satisfaction of someone watching karma play out in real time. Hannah's face was unreadable, but the disappointment in her eyes was clear. "Liana," she said in a quiet but firm voice, "you need to sit down. Right now." Liana barely heard her. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to collect herself. This couldn't be happening. She had worked for this airline for years, built a reputation, earned the respect of her colleagues. And now all of that was hanging by a thread because of one slap. No, she thought wildly. It wasn't just the slap. It was everything. The questioning, the humiliation, the way she had tried to force Roshni into proving she belonged. And worst of all, she had done it loudly, in front of an audience, making sure everyone knew she didn't think Roshni deserved to be there. Now, everyone was watching her downfall. The sudden ding of the intercom made her flinch. Then the captain's voice echoed through the cabin. "Ms. Liana, please report to the cockpit immediately." Liana's stomach dropped further. Celeste let out a low chuckle. "Oh, this just keeps getting better," she muttered under her breath. Liana swallowed hard, her throat dry. She forced her legs to move, stepping away from Roshni and walking toward the front of the plane. It felt like every eye in the cabin was on her, burning into her back, waiting to see what would happen next. The moment she entered the cockpit, the door shut behind her with a soft click. The captain, a middle-aged man with years of experience, didn't look at her right away. His hands remained steady on the controls, but his jaw was tight, his eyes locked onto the panel in front of him. But it wasn't the captain who spoke first. A voice crackled through the speaker of the in-flight communication screen. The screen displayed a video call from an office back on the ground. The man on the other end had sharp features, his dark eyes unreadable. "Liana." Her breath caught. She recognized him immediately. He was one of Veer Rajan's senior executives. "You're aware of who you just assaulted, correct?" he asked, his voice cold. Liana opened her mouth, but no words came out. The executive's expression didn't change. "I'll make this brief," he continued. "Mr. Rajan has been informed of your actions. We've been given direct orders. Effective immediately, you are removed from duty for the remainder of this flight. Upon landing, security will be waiting to escort you off the aircraft. You will be placed under disciplinary review, and I strongly suggest you prepare a formal statement. Because if Mr. Rajan chooses to pursue this further, you won't just lose your job. You will never work in this industry again." Liana's knees nearly buckled. The cockpit was silent except for the steady hum of the aircraft. The captain finally turned his head slightly, his voice quiet but firm. "You should return to your seat, Liana, while you still have one." Liana couldn't breathe. She wanted to plead, to explain, to say something that would fix this, but there was nothing to say. She had done this to herself. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the cockpit, her hands cold, her face burning. As she re-entered the business class cabin, she felt the shift in the air immediately. The passengers who had once barely acknowledged her presence now watched her closely, some with curiosity, others with satisfaction. She avoided their eyes, walking past them stiffly, trying to keep whatever dignity she had left. Then she saw Roshni. She was still seated, still calm, still composed. She hadn't gloated, hadn't smiled smugly, hadn't said a single word. That made it worse. Liana stopped near her seat, hesitating. She wanted to say something, anything. But before she could, a quiet chime rang through the cabin. One Liana had never wanted to hear in this context. The seatbelt sign dinged on. They were beginning their descent. Her fate was waiting for her on the ground, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The plane continued its descent, and with each passing second, Liana felt the walls closing in on her. The engines hummed steadily. The overhead lights flickered slightly as the aircraft adjusted altitude, and the weight of what awaited her on the ground pressed down like a crushing force. She had spent years walking through airports with confidence, her uniform crisp, her posture straight, commanding respect with just a glance. But now, for the first time, she felt small. She returned to the galley, her steps slower than before. Hannah was already there, arms crossed, watching her carefully. The moment Liana stepped inside, Hannah let out a breath, shaking her head. "They're waiting for you," she said simply. Liana pressed her lips together. She already knew that. Security, the executives, and worst of all, Veer Rajan himself. "Liana," Hannah continued, her voice softer now, "do you even realize how badly you messed up?" Liana let out a bitter breath, gripping the edge of the counter. "I know." Hannah sighed, rubbing her temples. "No, I don't think you do. This isn't just about you losing your job. This isn't a normal passenger complaint that'll disappear after a few meetings with HR. You put your hands on the wife of one of the most powerful men in the airline industry. Do you have any idea what that means?" Liana closed her eyes for a moment. She did know. It meant she had not only ruined her career but also destroyed any chance of recovering from this. Airlines talked, airports talked. One mistake could follow someone forever, especially one like this. But what frustrated her the most, what made her stomach twist painfully, was that she had done it over something so stupid. She had let her pride, her arrogance, and her own assumptions push her into making the worst decision of her life. She had looked at Roshni and assumed she was nothing. And now, Roshni was the one who held all the power. Hannah's voice softened again. "Look, I don't know what's going to happen when we land, but I suggest you start thinking about what you're going to say. Because right now, Liana, you have two choices. Own up to what you did, or let this be the end of you." Liana didn't answer. Hannah sighed again, giving her one last look before walking away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The descent continued, and back in the business class cabin, Roshni sat quietly, buckling her seatbelt as the flight attendants made their final rounds. She could feel the energy in the air, some passengers sneaking glances at her, others too embarrassed to look in her direction after watching what had happened. Adrian, who had been so smug earlier, now sat stiffly in his seat, eyes fixed on the window. He hadn't spoken another word after realizing who Roshni was. Celeste, on the other hand, seemed fully entertained, occasionally stealing glances toward Liana whenever she passed. Roshni wasn't interested in their reactions. Her focus was elsewhere. She reached for her phone again, checking for updates. A message from Veer popped up on her screen. "Veer. Security is ready. They'll escort her off the plane first. Wait for me at the terminal." She exhaled slowly, locking the screen. It wasn't anger that she felt, at least not anymore. It was something else. Liana had tried to humiliate her, had judged her based on appearance, and had even resorted to violence. But, in the end, she had only destroyed herself. Roshni didn't need revenge. She didn't need to shout or demand justice. She just needed to wait. The plane dipped lower, the runway now visible through the small oval windows. The intercom crackled as the captain's voice returned. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." A hush fell over the cabin. Liana forced herself to straighten up, moving through the aisles one last time. She could feel the way passengers looked at her now, not with respect, not with the usual polite indifference, but with curiosity, with quiet judgment. She had been the one in control at the start of this flight. Now, she was the one everyone pitied. As the wheels touched the ground, a heavy silence settled over her. Her time was up, and she had never been more terrified in her entire life. The moment the wheels touched the runway, Liana's body tensed. The usual sense of relief that came with landing a flight wasn't there. Instead, a wave of dread crashed over her, suffocating and inescapable. She gripped the side of a seat as the aircraft slowed, her breaths shallow. This was it. The final few moments before everything she had built came crashing down. The passengers sat in silence, waiting for the usual instructions. But there was something different about the energy in the cabin. They weren't just waiting to disembark. They were waiting to see what would happen next. Roshni remained still, her seatbelt fastened, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She didn't look at Liana, didn't acknowledge the growing panic on the flight attendant's face. She didn't have to. Liana had already unraveled on her own. The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The local time is 3:45 p.m. For your safety, please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. Thank you for flying with us." The seatbelt sign remained on, but Liana knew it wouldn't be for long. She glanced toward the front of the plane, where the entrance to the jet bridge would soon be connected. But instead of the usual crew members waiting outside, she saw them. Two uniformed security officers stood just beyond the glass window of the jet bridge. Their hands were clasped in front of them, their expressions unreadable. They were waiting for her. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Hannah returned from the galley, stopping just behind her. She must have seen them too, because her expression was grim. "You should start preparing yourself," Hannah murmured. Liana's throat tightened. "I can explain." Hannah turned to her sharply. "Explain what? That you spent an entire flight harassing a passenger because you assumed she was beneath you? That you slapped her in front of an entire cabin full of witnesses?" She exhaled heavily. "Liana, there is no explanation. There's just accountability." Liana's fingers clenched at her sides. The plane slowed to a complete stop, and a moment later, the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign turning off filled the cabin. The usual rustling of passengers gathering their belongings began, but the usual rush to the aisles was absent. Everyone was still watching. The flight attendant near the door hesitated, her fingers hovering over the intercom button before pressing it. "Ms. Liana, please proceed to the front of the aircraft immediately." The words cut through the silence. Passengers turned their heads, some openly staring, others pretending to be occupied with their luggage but listening closely. Celeste leaned back in her seat, shaking her head with an amused sigh. "Well, this is awkward." Liana's legs felt like lead as she took a step forward. Each movement felt heavier than the last, like she was dragging the weight of her own downfall with her. As she walked past Roshni's seat, she slowed slightly, expecting, hoping for some reaction. A glance, a smirk, anything. But Roshni remained still, looking at her with the same composed expression she had worn throughout the flight. It wasn't the look of someone who wanted revenge. It was the look of someone who had already won. Liana turned away quickly, shame burning her skin as she walked toward the front of the aircraft. The flight crew by the door stepped aside as she approached, their expressions carefully neutral. No one spoke. No one needed to. The door opened. The security officers stepped inside. "Liana Carter?" one of them asked. Her mouth went dry. "Yes," she croaked. "You need to come with us." A murmur rippled through the passengers. She swallowed hard and nodded. With shaking hands, she unpinned her flight attendant badge from her uniform, gripping it tightly for a moment before forcing herself to let go. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, she felt the finality of it all settle deep into her bones. She had started this flight believing she was untouchable. Now, she was walking off of it with nothing. And on the other side of that jet bridge, Veer Rajan was waiting. Liana stepped onto the jet bridge, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The air inside felt colder than the aircraft, or maybe it was just the chill settling deep within her bones. Her once confident stride had become hesitant, her body stiff with the weight of her actions. Every step forward felt like stepping toward the inevitable. The security officers flanked her on either side, their movements steady, professional, but their presence alone made her feel suffocated. She had never been on this side of authority before. Never been the one escorted, the one under scrutiny, the one at risk of losing everything. As she neared the terminal exit, a new figure came into view. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark tailored suit, Veer Rajan stood waiting just beyond the glass doors. His presence alone commanded attention. Passengers walking past him instinctively lowered their voices. Airport staff straightened their postures, and even the security officers escorting Liana seemed more alert. Liana had never met him in person, but she had heard his name countless times. The airline's executives spoke of him with deep respect. The employees whispered about him like he was a legend. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to be heard. And now, she had to face him. Her stomach twisted painfully as she stepped through the doors, her feet halting just a few steps away from him. The security officers stepped back slightly, giving them space but still standing close enough to remind her that she wasn't free to simply walk away. For a long, agonizing moment, Veer said nothing. His sharp gaze flickered over her, studying her with a level of calm that was far more unsettling than anger. He wasn't the type to lash out or lose his temper. He was the type to make decisions with quiet precision, and Liana knew that whatever he had already decided, it wouldn't be in her favor. She opened her mouth, desperate to say something, anything, that might fix the damage she had done. "Mr. Rajan, He lifted a hand, silencing her instantly. Liana swallowed hard, her words dying in her throat. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low but firm. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Liana's fingers trembled at her sides. She wanted to defend herself, to say that she had made a mistake, that she hadn't meant for things to escalate the way they did. But she knew better than to insult his intelligence with excuses. Still, her voice came out in a whisper. "It wasn't personal. I didn't know who she was." A flicker of something dangerous passed through Veer's eyes. "You didn't need to know who she was," he said evenly. "You only needed to treat her with basic respect." Liana's breath caught. "You judged her based on nothing but her appearance. You questioned her presence in business class. You humiliated her in front of other passengers. And then, when you couldn't force her to react, you struck her." His words were sharp, slicing through whatever weak defenses she had left. Liana's entire body felt cold. She hesitated. "I lost my temper. I know that, and I regret." Veer took a single step closer, his presence towering over her, making her feel unbearably small. "Your regret means nothing," he said, his tone eerily calm. "Not to me, not to my wife." Liana's stomach twisted painfully. "I built this airline on the foundation of respect and professionalism," Veer continued. "Thousands of employees work under my name, and every single one of them is a reflection of the company I created. And today, you prove to be the kind of person who does not belong here." Liana felt her breath grow unsteady. Veer turned slightly, gesturing toward one of the executives standing nearby. A middle-aged man in a gray suit stepped forward, a folder in his hand. Without a word, he handed it to Veer, who flipped it open and pulled out a single document. Liana barely had time to process it before he extended it toward her. "Effective immediately," he said. "Your employment with this airline is terminated." The words hit her harder than the slap she had given Roshni. Her vision blurred slightly as she stared at the document. The official letter, stamped with the airline's logo, detailed her dismissal in cold, precise wording. There was no room for negotiation, no offer of suspension or retraining. This was final. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I've worked here for 10 years. This job is all I have." Veer's expression didn't change. "You should have thought about that before you let your arrogance destroy it." Tears burned in the corners of Liana's eyes, but she forced them down. "Security will escort you out of the airport," Veer added. "Your belongings will be sent to you. You are not to enter any of our facilities again." Liana felt like she was standing on a crumbling edge, one wrong step away from losing herself completely. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked, her voice desperate now. Veer studied her for a long moment, then let out a quiet sigh. "That depends," he said. "Are you asking how to fix your career?" Liana hesitated, nodding slightly. "Then no," he said bluntly. "There is nothing you can do." She felt her heart crack. "But if you're asking how to fix yourself," he continued, "then maybe start by asking why you thought a woman in a simple dress didn't deserve to be treated like a human being." Liana's breath shuddered out of her lungs. She wanted to argue, to insist that it hadn't been like that she hadn't meant to be cruel, but deep down she knew. She had seen Roshni as less, and now she had paid the price for it. The weight of everything came crashing down on her. The reality that she had lost her job, that she would never work in this industry again, that she had humiliated herself in front of an entire plane full of people, all because of a woman she had assumed was beneath her. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Veer gave a small nod to the security officers. "Take her out." Liana's chest tightened as they stepped forward. Her legs felt weak as she forced herself to move, her footsteps heavy as she was led through the terminal. Passengers who had witnessed the incident were already moving through the airport, some glancing at her as she passed. Some whispered. Others shook their heads. Celeste, walking toward baggage claim, smirked as she passed. "That was hard to watch," she said with false sympathy. "Well, for you, anyway." Liana clenched her fists, keeping her head down as she kept walking. She had started this flight thinking she was in control. Now she was nothing more than a disgraced former employee, walking out of the very airport she once ruled over. And Roshni. She had never lifted a hand against her, never raised her voice. But she had won. And the worst part? Liana knew she deserved it. Liana's feet dragged against the polished airport floor as she was escorted through the terminal, the weight of her downfall pressing down on her shoulders like a boulder. She had been in this airport hundreds of times, walking these same halls with her head held high, her uniform pristine, her presence commanding respect. But today, she was being escorted out like a criminal. The security officers remained silent as they walked beside her, their expressions unreadable. They weren't rough with her, didn't grip her arms or force her to move faster. They didn't need to. She had already lost. The humiliation of being watched, of passengers whispering, of employees averting their eyes, of ground staff realizing that she was no longer one of them, was punishment enough. Her mind raced for solutions, for a way to salvage something from the wreckage she had created. Would another airline take her? Could she spin the situation in her favor? But every thought ended in the same sinking realization. This wasn't just about losing her job. This was about losing everything. She had been with this airline for 10 years. She had built her career here, climbed through the ranks, believed she was untouchable. And in less than a few hours, she had destroyed it all with her own arrogance. As they neared the exit, she heard footsteps approaching from behind. "Liana!" She flinched at the familiar voice and turned slightly. Hannah, her former colleague, because that's what she was now, former, stood a few feet away, her face conflicted. She had a small bag in her hands, Liana's personal belongings that had been taken from her before she left the plane. Liana swallowed hard, dreading whatever Hannah had to say. But when Hannah spoke, her voice wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was tired. "You didn't have to let it get this far," Hannah said, shaking her head as she handed over the bag. Liana took it slowly, fingers curling around the strap. "I know," she admitted, her voice hoarse. Hannah sighed. "I told you to let it go. I warned you." Liana exhaled sharply, looking down. "I thought I was right." "And now?" Hannah challenged. Liana hesitated, then forced herself to meet Hannah's eyes. "Now, I know I wasn't." Hannah studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. "It's too late for this job, Liana," she said, voice firm but not unkind. "But maybe it's not too late for you to figure out why you did what you did." Liana's throat tightened. There were so many things she could have said, so many ways she could have tried to defend herself. But there was nothing left to defend. She had assumed Roshni was beneath her. She had humiliated her, questioned her, disrespected her. And when that hadn't been enough, she had hit her. And why? Because she hadn't been able to accept the idea that someone like Roshni belonged in business class? That someone who didn't look wealthy could afford the same luxuries as the passenger she had spent years catering to. She had spent her entire career believing she knew who belonged where, and today she had been proven wrong in the most painful way possible. She had deserved to be proven wrong. Hannah gave her a long look before stepping back. "Take care of yourself, Liana." And with that, she turned and walked away. Liana watched her go, feeling a strange hollowness settle inside her chest. For the first time in her life, she had no uniform, no title, no position of authority to cling to. She was just Liana, and she wasn't sure who that was without the power she once held. The security officers motioned for her to continue walking. She did, and just as she was about to step through the automatic exit doors, she heard another voice, one that made her entire body go still. "That's her?" Liana turned her head slowly, dread curling in her stomach. Roshni stood a few feet away, her posture still composed, her expression unreadable. But this time, she wasn't alone. Veer Rajan stood beside her. His presence alone was enough to make Liana feel like she was shrinking into herself. He wasn't yelling, wasn't threatening her, but the quiet intensity in his eyes was worse. She forced herself to straighten. "Mr. Rajan," she started, her voice weak. He didn't respond at first. He simply looked at her, and then he turned to his wife. "Do you want to say anything to her?" he asked calmly. Roshni studied Liana for a long moment. Liana braced herself. This was it. This was where Roshni would finally give her the punishment she deserved. Maybe she'd say something cutting, something that would burn itself into Liana's memory forever. Maybe she'd tell her she was worthless, that she would never recover from this. But Roshni didn't do any of that. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and said, "I don't need to." Liana felt like she had been struck again. Roshni didn't need to say anything, because the silence, the weight of her composed gaze, the way she had walked through this entire situation with dignity, that was enough. Liana had tried to break her, but in the end, the only person who had been destroyed was herself. The doors behind Liana slid open with a soft hiss, and the cold air from outside rushed in. The security officers motioned for her to step forward. Liana swallowed hard, her heart pounding as she turned away from the couple for the last time. And as she walked out of the airport, she knew one thing for certain. She had spent her entire career believing she had the power to decide who belonged. But today, she had learned the most painful lesson of all. Power was never about the uniform. It was about the way you treated people. And she had failed. The airport doors slid shut behind Liana, cutting her off from the world she had once controlled. The moment she stepped outside, the cold air hit her like a slap, one that didn't just sting her skin, but her pride, her arrogance, everything she had built her life around. The world moved on around her. Travelers wheeling their suitcases past, taxis pulling up to collect passengers, airport staff going about their routines. No one cared who she was. No one cared that just hours ago she had walked these halls as a senior flight attendant, commanding respect. Because now, she was no one. Her hands trembled as she clutched the strap of her small bag. Her career, gone. Her reputation, shattered. The life she had spent 10 years building had crumbled in a single flight, all because of a mistake she couldn't take back. No, she corrected herself bitterly. Not a mistake, a choice. She had chosen to judge Roshni. She had chosen to treat her like she was beneath her. She had chosen to strike her when she didn't get the reaction she wanted. And now, she was paying the price for it. Her legs felt weak as she made her way toward the taxi stand. The security officers had left her at the curb. Their job done. She wasn't being arrested. Veer Rajan hadn't pressed charges, though he very well could have. That somehow made it worse. He could have destroyed her, but instead, he had let her do it to herself. Liana swallowed hard as she reached the front of the taxi line. The driver barely spared her a glance as he popped open the trunk for her. She tossed her bag inside and slid into the back seat, her mind still spinning. "Where to?" the driver asked, his voice indifferent. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Where was she supposed to go? For years, the airline had been her home. She had spent more time in airports and airplanes than she had in her own apartment. The job had been everything to her, her identity, her power, her entire life. And now that it was gone, she realized she had nothing outside of it. Her throat tightened. Just drive, she murmured. The driver shrugged and pulled out of the airport, merging onto the road. As the city blurred past her window, her mind kept replaying everything. The way passengers had watched her downfall, the way Hannah had looked at her with disappointment instead of sympathy, the way Veer Rajan had barely spoken a handful of words to her, but had still dismantled everything she had once believed about herself. And then there was Roshni, who had never raised her voice, who had never tried to humiliate her back, who had never needed to retaliate. She had been calm, steady, and somehow that had been more powerful than anything Liana had ever seen before. Liana had spent so many years believing that power came from status, from authority, from being in control. But Roshni had shown her a different kind of power, the kind that didn't need to prove itself, the kind that didn't need to demand respect because it had already been earned. Liana had spent her entire career looking down on people she thought were beneath her. And today she had learned the truth. The only person beneath anyone was her. The car hit a red light, and for the first time since stepping off that plane, Liana allowed herself to truly feel the weight of what had happened. Her hands curled into fists on her lap. She had lost everything, and the worst part? She had done it to herself. The taxi moved through the city, but Liana barely registered the passing streets. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, a ghost of the woman she had been just hours ago. She used to walk with confidence, with purpose, with the certainty that she was untouchable in her position. But now she sat in the back of a taxi with nothing but a bag of personal belongings and a career she had thrown away with her own arrogance. Her phone buzzed in her lap. A cruel part of her hoped, just for a moment, that maybe it was someone from the airline. Maybe a chance to fix this, maybe some last-minute reversal of her fate. But when she turned the screen over, reality hit her like a punch to the gut. A news notification. Senior flight attendant from Rajan Airlines fired mid-flight for misconduct against CEO's wife. Her stomach twisted. The moment she tapped the article, the details spilled onto the screen. Her name, her actions, her humiliation written out for the entire world to see. Passengers had already begun sharing their experiences online, recounting every moment of what had happened. Her questioning of Roshni, the demeaning comments, and, of course, the slap that sealed her fate. A video was attached. Liana hesitated, her finger hovering over the play button. She already knew what she would see. Still, she pressed it. The shaky footage started with her standing in front of Roshni in the aisle, her posture rigid with frustration. The camera caught her sharp tone, the way she tried to corner Roshni with her words, and then, clear as day, the moment her hand flew across Roshni's face, the cabin's collective gasp, the stunned silence, the disbelief. And then the most painful part, Roshni's reaction, or rather the lack of it. She hadn't recoiled, hadn't lashed out, hadn't given Liana the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had simply stood there, calm, composed. And in that moment, Liana hadn't just lost her temper, she had lost the fight. The video ended, and Liana let out a shaky breath. She scrolled down to the comments. She shouldn't have. Wow, she really thought she could get away with that? This is why people in power need to be checked. Imagine how many others she's bullied before getting caught. Roshni handled that like a queen. Her career is over. The words sank into her like knives. Liana had spent years believing she was in control. She had built her reputation on the idea that she knew how to handle people, how to command respect, how to be the authority figure in any situation. But in one moment of unchecked arrogance, she had proven to the world that she was nothing more than a bully. The car slowed to a stop. "Ma'am," the driver said, pulling her out of her daze. "We're here." Liana blinked, looking up. The apartment building where she lived felt unfamiliar now, as if it belonged to someone else. Someone who still had a career, someone who still had a future. She pulled out her wallet, fingers shaking as she handed over the fare. The driver didn't look at her twice. She was just another passenger to him. Just another nobody. Liana stepped out of the car, her feet unsteady as she approached the entrance. She could already picture it, her landlord asking why she was home so early. Her neighbors whispering when they saw the news. The quiet, crushing reality of having to wake up tomorrow with no job to go to. As she reached for the door handle, her phone buzzed again. Another notification. This time, a direct message. From Hannah. She hesitated before opening it. "Hannah, you were awful to her, Liana. But I still don't think you're beyond redemption. I hope you learn from this." Liana inhaled sharply, gripping her phone tightly. She didn't know if redemption was possible. She didn't know if she could ever fix the damage she had done. But for the first time, as she stepped inside and closed the door behind her, she realized something. She had spent her entire life believing power came from status, from control, from forcing others to recognize her authority. But real power, the kind that mattered, came from something else entirely. And the woman she had looked down on, the woman she had tried to humiliate, Roshni had possessed it all along. Liana had lost everything. But maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something else. Something she should have learned a long time ago. If you liked this story, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.